Welcome back to another lecture. Mr. King, and today we're going to be looking at the idea of socialism in the 19th century. And in particular, we're going to be looking at utopian answers to the problem of mass misery caused by industrialization. And up at the top, you see a circle there with the idea that socialism, the radical idea of sharing. So that should give you some idea about the idea of socialism, which you probably encountered and studied at some point, either as juniors or as sophomores. So we're going to take a look at the context. And so by way of introduction, you see a picture there of an industrial city in England. And we already know that the Industrial Revolution transformed the economies and society in Western Europe in the late 18th and 19th century. Now, in the early 1800s, discussions began to occur about how to deal with the miserable conditions in which much of the laboring, that is, working classes lived, and these discussions about the poor living conditions and poverty are really going to spark a series of social protest movements that are going to take up the cause of misery and human suffering. And the one idea that many protest movements shared in common was the idea of achieving a state of equality for all people that would be brought about by political and social change. So we've talked about political change in particular in England, where we saw the idea of the Great Reform. We saw also revolutions that broke out in much of Europe. We saw nationalist movements trying to affect change. And so now we're going to add this idea of social protest, social change. And when we think about the early socialists that we're going to look at today, and they're basically called the Utopian Socialists, so I'll advance the slide. One of the things I think we have to keep in mind and be very clear about is that Utopian Socialists believed in reforms, though reforms not by revolution. That's going to be really Marx and Engels' contribution, 1848, in the Communist Manifesto. But these Utopian Socialists predate Marx and Engels, and they believe in reform movements. And they were intellectuals, they were writers, in some cases they were even wealthy factory owners. They were maybe even members of the old regime nobility that had had a change of heart. So it's a rather interesting collection of individuals that we'll get to at the end of this lecture. But let's take a look at the Utopian Socialist. And most Utopian Socialists were French, although there was one German named Moses Hess. And they were often very critical of the Industrial Revolution and the society that the Industrial Revolution and capitalism was creating. And so we can say that these socialists reacted strongly to the ideas of the liberal economists Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, and David Ricardo that we discussed. So they're stridently anti-liberal. Another thing that we can think about is the Utopian socialists dream of creating or fashioning a new way of life and a more harmonious way of life. And you can see that picture to the right. The idea of a new kind of model town, a new factory town, that doesn't look like the factory that we saw in the previous slide. Let me just flip back to that. That's the factory that was real in England in the 19th century. And on the right there, you see this idea, this dream of a new factory town. Quite a different look, and I think you can see that very clearly. The other thing we want to look at with Utopian Socialists, and that is, although they had some really unusual ideas, and that often didn't work out in reality, their idealism captured the imagination of the working class, and over time, that was going to help the working class begin to advance demands for political and social reforms. And I would say that it was not only the working class, but it was also members of that middling order, the bourgeoisie, to some extent, that was also captured and swept up in this kind of utopian movement. So we're going to see that while the utopians by and large fail, they are able to capture the imagination, and that's going to help advance demands. So we're going to move forward here, and we're going to look at 4 points about utopians So, and on the right, I think you see sort of this, again, this new dream-like city of the future. And that's obviously modern. That would not have been in the 19th century. But nonetheless, I think it conveys the idea. So, point one, utopian socialists were horrified by the living conditions of the working poor. Point number two, utopians doubted that those who profited from industrialization, that is the owners of factories, the owners of great wealth, the great bankers, if you will, the financiers, the successful lawyers and doctors, those that make up, again, this middling order, the upper middle class bourgeoisie. Utopians doubted that these individuals had any interest at all in solving the social question, and the social question was the idea of poverty and poor living conditions. Number three, so point three, utopians reject the spirit of individualism that was articulated by Adam Smith and other liberal economic thinkers, and liberals in general focused a great deal on the individual and the individual's freedom and independence to cultivate their intellect, to build their own character, to forge their own destinies. So the utopians are going to, simply put, reject the idea of the individual. And so what are they going to replace it with? Well, they're going to replace it with this idea of a world based on cooperation among individuals. So individuals are not going to be out for their own personal gain and benefit, but they're going to learn to coexist peacefully and to cooperate. Point four, utopians were in many ways children of the Enlightenment. And by that I mean utopians were optimists about the application of human reason and science that would make possible and real a new social and political order, and new cities, new living spaces, new concepts of living spaces. And again, you can see that there on the right. So those are 4 points that I think utopians, by which we can identify utopians, and by that I mean utopian socialists. All right, so who were some of these utopians? So we're going to look at 6 of them in rapid succession. The first you see here is Count Claude Henri Saint-Simon. He was a French count, and in the early 1800s he began to write about the idea of a religion of humanity. And this new religion would, and I quote, direct society toward the great end of the most rapid amelioration possible of the lot of the poorest class, end quote. So what Saint-Simon says is this new religion of humanity that replaces the old traditional forms of religion is going to lead to a rapid improvement for the poor. And Saint-Simon believed that history moved through stages. And in that, he's very similar to Hegel, to Marx, to Vico. And Saint-Simon posited that that humankind could look forward to a bright future in which science would solve the material problems that plagued humanity, and that the new world would be one based on improved morality, so improved living conditions, but also moral improvement. And again, that's kind of like a middle class idea too, but the utopian socialists are going to incorporate that, at least Saint-Simon was. The second utopian socialist we see here is Charles Fourier, and he was a more mystical type, a rival of Saint-Simon, who began to argue that selling goods in the free market and in a market economy often involve lying and deception. Fourier himself, with his father's help and encouragement, began a business in the French city of Lyon, which quickly failed. And after this business failure, Fourier spent his entire life preparing a scheme to improve the condition of humanity. Fourier, too, believed, like Saint-Simon, that history moved in cycles and that history was moving ever progressively towards mankind's discovery, that is, becoming conscious or aware, mankind's discovery of the principles of cooperation and harmony. And once man discovered or became aware of these principles, humankind, I should say, would be free from the repression that bourgeoisie middle-class society represented and forced upon individuals. So Fourier proposed in his scheme, and this is really one of the crackpot ideas, this idea of communities of 1,620 people, very exact, called phalanxes, and that these phalanxes would channel human passions into socially productive work. And therefore, we see this idea of the community called the phalanx channeling individual passions to produce something that would be the social good, and that would lead to the spirit of cooperation. So individuals would not be pursuing their own self-interest and the accumulation of individual wealth, but they would be pursuing the idea of a better community. And Fourier, again, interesting story, kind of sat in his apartment, writing and writing and writing and refining his schemes, waiting for people, that is men of means, to show up at his doorstep with a check in hand to finance his phalanxes. And I think you can guess, nobody showed up. So Fourier, an interesting case study. The next individual we're going to see is Robert Owen, a social visionary, as you can see from the title of this book. He was an industrialist and a philanthropist, and he really acted out on his beliefs in that a clean environment and education could produce a spirit of cooperation. And so what he did was he created these new model societies, these new factory towns, one being New Lanark in Scotland, and even one here in Indiana called New Harmony. And he provided his factory workers, that is his mill workers, with clean housing and schools. And he believed also in the emancipation of women in order to create a society of progress, though he did not advocate for equal rights, political rights for women. Now, again, Owen's ideas were a bit ahead of their time, and they don't pan out. But again, the idea that a factory owner adopted this type of model, this visionary model, again, fits nicely within the utopian socialist order. Now we're going to look at, on the right, another French utopian socialist, not well known, Etienne Cabet. He was one of the most popular, however, of the utopian socialists in France, and he wanted to apply the principles of Christianity to the social problems of the 1830s and 1840s. In that way, he might be a bit like Tsar Alexander and the Holy Alliance, that is, rediscovering Christian morality and applying it to the world, whether it be the world of diplomacy and the concert system for Tsar Alexander, or Etienne Cabet applying it to the social problems of the 1830s and 40s. And he really kind of creates in his novel called The Voyage to Icaria this idea of a perfect, clean city with clean public bathrooms, with schools, with an organized social and economic life that would allow people to embrace utopian socialism, especially those of the bourgeois middling orders. So interesting, most popular in France. We're going to continue now with our last two, Louis Blanc on the left, who was a utopian that looked at the French state for improvement of the condition of the working class. So he wants to use the state that already exists in France, though he wants to reform it, and he wants to reform that state by arguing that the state has an obligation to provide workers with work. So this idea of create work or create jobs, programs, infrastructure, and those types of things that you might be familiar with today from the New Deal or even today. He also believed that there should be a living wage for workers. So he calls for these things called workers' workshops, which we see in the Revolution of 1848. They were essentially guilds that would be directly responsible for the production and sale of goods. And these workshops would form the basis for the reorganization and the revitalization of society along cooperative lines. He also wanted universal suffrage to allow workers to elect representatives to reform the state. So interesting that he kind of lines up with the Chartist of England. And last but not least, we have Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who is a utopian who doesn't believe in property. He believes that property is exploitation that destroys people, destroys this idea of cooperation, and therefore he says essentially all property is theft, and therefore property should be abolished outright, and workers should organize themselves in small communities where they could cooperate and share their property. So with that, we've come to the end of the idea of utopian socialism, and our next step and next lecture is going to be dedicated to the idea of Marxist socialism. So if there are any questions, please let me know. Thank you very much.